Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Karl Friedhoff, and I am the Marshall M. Bouton Fellow for Asia Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and especially our members for joining this conversation on confronting China's rise. I was the project director for this report, and I'm very excited to finally have it out to the public and to share it with everyone here, as well as to hear comments from our co-chairs on the report itself and to expand on that a little bit. Before we get started, please note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional policy positions. Views expressed by participants on the program are, of course, their own. This program marks the launch of the Council's new report, Cooperating, Competing, Confronting, US, Japan, South Korea, Trilateral Cooperation as China Rises, and was generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Korea Foundation, and the Nakasone Peace Institute. If you have a question for the panel, we will be taking audience questions in about 30 minutes or so via ccga.live. Simply enter ccga.live into your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there. With that said, I'd like to welcome our panelists to this conversation. Joining us from Japan, we have Ambassador Fujisaki Ichiro. He is the president of the Nakasone Peace Institute and previously served as Ambassador of Japan to the United States. For the US co-chair, we have Jim Steinberg. He is a professor at Syracuse University and previously served as US Deputy Secretary of State. And finally, from South Korea, Sung-Joo. He is the chairman of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and was formerly Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the United States, as well as Foreign Minister of South Korea. And finally, moderating the discussion is the Council's Vice President of Studies, Brian Hanson. Before kicking it over to Brian, I would also note that he hosts the Council's podcast, Deep Dish, and the most recent episode is about the 100th anniversary of the CCP. You can find that wherever you get your podcast. With that, Brian.
Terrific. Thanks, Karl. And thank you for leading this report. I want to really welcome Sung-Joo, Ichiro, and Jim to this conversation. You all have just finished chairing and producing a report that's called Cooperating, Competing, Confronting US, Japan, South Korea, Trilateral Cooperation as China Rises. And I think one of the things that interested me, as you note in the beginning of the report, is that one of the great stories of the last half century in Asia has been how the US, Japan, South Korea have worked together in promoting economic prosperity, maintaining the peace, and advancing trade and human rights in the region. It's a really remarkable success story. And all the more remarkable given that unlike the transatlantic relationship where you have this institution of NATO that coordinates how allies work together, in Asia, we have a series of bilateral relationships. So between the US, Japan, the US and South Korea, and we don't have that same institutional structure. So today, of course, there's much change happening in the world. The emergence of a very self-assured China as a power on the world stage, reflecting years of successful economic growth and the forceful leadership of Xi Jinping. And lots of questions being asked about, in this new environment, how do we work together to support common goals? And Jim, let me start with you and just ask you, as you think about the most important context for this report, what are the key factors that you all had in mind as you were thinking about, how we cooperate together going forward?
Well, thank you, Brian. And let me just begin by both thanking my fellow co-chairs, Ambassador Fujisaki and Minister Han, for the opportunity to work together. We've known each other and worked together over many, many years. And I want to thank the other members of each of our teams. So we had a great group of colleagues who worked with us on this report. And the reason I mention that is because it is the fact that we have worked together so effectively over many years, and that in part, we worked together to transform our relationship from what was once very heavily rooted in the Cold War to a very 21st century kind of relationship. And my two fellow chairs were part of that process in the early 90s when we tried to think about how we needed to reimagine the relationship between allies when we no longer had to face the Cold War issues, but wanted to think about facing the new kinds of challenges. And so the work we did together in the 90s to make this relationship relevant is very important to making us successful today. And we began that process. When in my earlier incarnations and when I was head of policy planning during the Clinton administration, we had a trilateral policy planning dialogue between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. And we recognize that although we have some differences in our perspectives and specific interests that differ, that we have a broadly shared set of goals and values that animate our foreign policy and that provides us a unique advantage both in dealing with China and dealing with many of the other challenges we face in this world. And that we wanted to husband and sustain that as a core strength of dealing with big challenges. Now, what's happened over the last 30 years is the dramatic rise of China, and it's put the relationship with China in front and center. And again, we've recognized that core sets of shared values and interests that we have are one of our unique assets in making sure that we can confront this challenge in a way that serves our mutual interests, that tries to incorporate and engage China in a positive way, but is also ready to deal with a China that may not be so friendly or open to respecting our interests. And so that's what really gives us the strength and why it was so important to think about how we can work together to manage the complex problem that is China today.
And Ichiro, let me ask you to build on Jim's answer. From the Japanese perspective, kind of what are some of the key components as you look at this new environment that are important for Japan to address and are important goals? Oops, you're still muted. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Brian. Congratulations for the 100th anniversary, and I'd like to also thank my co-leaders from US and Korea. I think report speaks for itself, so I'll just add my personal, it's not Japanese really representative view, but you said, or Karl said, China's overly self-assured, assertive stance or policy, and I think that's true. But we have to really put this all in the context because I think a lot of us are too much overly focused on US-China rivalry. I think it's China versus others because China's change in behavior. Because Deng Zedong's strategy of buy time and is not there anymore. I think some of us are overly influenced by Alison Grant's Thucydides theory. So I think we should put it in context because if not, some of the ASEAN colleagues, very important, are saying, hey, don't let us choose between the two. It's not that. And I think we have to be very careful. I think, and also China's overly aggressive stance is hiding its weakness as well. If you look at inside China, Guizhou, which is the poorest province, GDP per capita is 1/4 of that of Shanghai. Is that sustainable in one country for a long time? We have to really watch that carefully as well. And also, that assertiveness may change as well because wolf warrior policies are paying its cost. I don't know how much we can count on it, but May 31st, Xi Jinping said, we want to have the image of China lovable, respectable, and trustworthy. And maybe they are getting signed because now many of the countries are UK, France, Germany, Australia, India, and others are sort of sending the sign to China that they can't just go on like that. And I think, I hope that they will be getting the sign. I think we are at this very important stage. That's what we have to understand, I think. Thanks.
And Sung-Joo, what would you add to this context that and the understanding of the reality in which these recommendations were formulated?
Well, I don't have much to add to what Jim and Ichiro said. I just want to congratulate ourselves that we came to an excellent draft report. We've overcome both the corona pandemic and also the predecessor of Mr. Biden, whose name I don't remember. And to be where we are with the report today, thanks are due to the Chicago Council for taking the initiative to conduct the project. And then there is Karl Friedhoff, who served as the project director, who played a critical role in the project itself and drafting of the report. I would also like to thank those in the trilateral countries who participated in the discussions and drafting of the report. So I'm glad that we had a lot more agreements than differences that Jim mentioned in our deliberations. I look forward to finding out where we go from here. So let's have a vigorous and productive meeting today. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Let's jump into the recommendations. And there are really three areas that you targeted in the report for cooperation and that you advanced on the agenda. And one of those was to coordinate how the three countries respond to China's economic coercion. And the report points out that both Japan and South Korea have been subject to China's economic coercion. And Ichiro, could you just share with us what the concern is here? What is the Chinese behavior?
Yes, I think China is taking tough stance, and some of the Japanese companies are worried that they may be sandwiched between the United States and China's strong stance. I think we are saying that they shouldn't. And if you sort of try to show your weakness or over consciousness, then that's exactly what they're waiting for. So I think we have to stay calm. And for example, on how China policy, US and Japan is, and Korea, I think, has the same value on human rights, democracy, freedom of speech. However, how we express that to China is different, and China understands that. So I think we want China to understand that Japan, US, and Korea is all on the same boat, but sometimes our nuances different on how to take approach, and I think that would be reflected on their approach to us as well. I think that's where we are. And on Republic of Korea and Japan relations, I think in the report it says that US should take a quiet stance on this, and I think that's very important because sometimes Japan and Republic of Korea have some issues, but that should be solved by ourselves, between us, and not really by asking a friend to come in and solve for us. I think we should do it, and I think this is clearly reflected on this report, page 12. There's Japan ROK collaboration on some of the issues, and these polls are very encouraging. So I think this study shows encouraging sign for ROK Japan collaboration as well. Thank you very much.
Brian, maybe I can come in a bit on this because I do think this is one of the more interesting conclusions that came up with you. As you mentioned, we've seen over the last decade a number of instances where China has used its privileged economic position to try to leverage that to influence the actions of countries, especially smaller countries, not very small countries. Neither Japan nor South Korea are very small countries. But in the case of Japan, we saw this during one of the incidents in the Sung-Joo Islands when China cut off Japan's access to rare earths, which were very important to Japan's electronics industry. We saw it in connection with the deployment of the THAAD anti-missile defense system in South Korea when China engaged in sanctions against an important South Korean country, Lotte. We've seen it against Australia in terms of some of Australia's exports to China and the like. And obviously China is trying to use its relative economic power vis-a-vis these countries to try to coerce them into doing things that they would otherwise not want to do. And the problem has been in the past, the United States really hasn't had, we've been sympathetic to our partners, but we haven't really had a strategy for how to respond there. We sort of said, well, we're on your side. But one of the conclusions we've come up with is we actually need the United States to play a more proactive role in supporting smaller countries when China tries to use that, and to try to think about whether there are ways that we can, in effect, undercut China's ability to use leverage by putting our own weight in the scales, whether it's finding economic tools that we can use to assist our allies, or finding ways to counter China's own actions in ways that would cause pain to China. And so the United States has to recognize it's harder for China to do it to us, but if we don't want our allies to be picked off by China, we need to be more actively engaged in supporting them so that they're not vulnerable to this kind of economic coercion. And that's what the report recommends, is really a more concerted effort to think about the tools we have together, because together it's much harder for China to exercise that kind of coercion.
Very good. And another area of focus with in the economic agenda was reforming the WTO and working together. Obviously, that's a big challenge. So it's bigger than something that the US, South Korea, and Japan can do on its own. But to bring together an effort, a multilateral effort to make the WTO more relevant and more effective. It's really been gutted with the appellate body not even functioning. Sung-Joo, could you talk a little bit about why the WTO is important in managing the relationship with China and why it's so important to get back on track?
Well, let me first say a little bit about the recommendations before I answer your question. I'll say two things about the recommendations. In our final report, I think we should make it a little more prominent than it is now. It sort of sneaks in at the end of section. So I think we have to make it a more conspicuous, more prominent, coherent part, a section in itself. The second point about the recommendations is that I think we might need one more item, which is something about what we might call human security or non-traditional security, which would include the issues of health and pandemics, global warming, and environment. The cleaning of the sea, for example, especially South China Sea, would be a good way of our cooperation in dealing with China from what the report says, outside in. And so I think we can reorganize the presentation of the recommendations a little bit. On the question of WTO, I had participated in the negotiation back in the early 1990s. And I was, in fact, in favor of including China in the WTO at that time, worldwide round, and which evolved into multilateral and then World Trade Organization. And so it is an effective way of harnessing China's ways of doing things. For example, China's coercive diplomacy using economy as a weapon of other policy objectives. And so I think it is an organization which is quite useful and important in more ways than one, that we really shouldn't let it sort of decline in importance as it seems to have happened during the past few years.
That's helpful. Yeah, Ichiro.
Talking about WTO, I think, of course, we have to really reform that institution. But one thing I think important is that in that process, we have to really introduce appellate body or the judicial system, which is the jewel in the crown, which we have been lacking for some time. And first, we have to really reintroduce that judicial system and then really talk about reform. If we include all that reform as one set, we will not come to conclusion for a long time. Also, as for what you have asked about China's coercion, I think what's good about this report is it's not talking about defensive stance of three countries, but trying to suggest positive areas where we could cooperate, like telecommunications, 6G, or cleaning up sea, where that would send a good message to the rest of the world as well. Thanks.
Yeah, that's, I think that's really, it comes through very clearly in this. And I think the other thing that's striking about the recommendations is that it is not a security or military strategy document, but it really is talking about places where the three countries can work together in order to achieve positive things in other areas. One of those areas that is discussed in the report is cooperation in Southeast Asia. And Jim, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see those opportunities in being and what came out of the report for how these countries could work together in that region.
Thanks, Brian. I think one of the things that we all felt very strongly was that it's important to try as best we can not to turn this into a new Cold War in which countries have two sides. Because I think we recognize that for most countries, that's a very uncomfortable and very undesirable result. They get a lot of benefits from engaging with China, but there are also a lot of costs and risks dependent on China. And so what we talked about is making sure that we're sufficiently engaged, especially in the region, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, that countries, they don't have to choose between us, but they also don't have only one option, which is to work with China. And particularly with China's various engaged strategy with the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been offering a lot in terms of economic opportunities, infrastructure support, and the like, and that we need to be in the game. And we need to be in the game so the countries can not be solely dependent on China and therefore vulnerable to China's coercion. And so we, as both the chair and Sung-Joo said, we want to offer a positive vision, not to say reject BRI and come with us, but rather say, we've got some things, and our approach may be more attractive to you because we're going to do this without corruption, with respecting human rights and labor rights and respecting the environment. And we're going to give you an opportunity to get some of the benefits that you get from engaging with China through the Belt and Road without some of the risks and costs associated with China's approach. And I think that's a way of drawing on our own strength, our values, transparency, of allowing countries to have a voice and not being told what to do, to respect values that we care about in terms of workers' rights and the environment and the like, and give them this positive opportunity that shows that we're there, we're part of this, we're not ceding the field to China, and we give them a chance to see that there's an opportunity to work with us as well.
And you know, you raised this point about not creating a new Cold War in here and forcing countries to choose. The other thing I think was interesting in the report is and it's come up a little bit in this conversation, is the U.S. policymaking process and perhaps needing to be more sensitive of listening to the needs and the perspectives of our Japanese and Korean allies. And I wonder what you have seen. I'd be interested in each of you responding to this. What you've seen from the Biden administration and the extent to which there is evidence that the current administration is listening and understanding the different perspectives that come out of each of your countries in terms of cooperation. Sung-Joo, you want to start off for us?
Can you make the question a little more specific?
Yeah, sorry. What is your sense of the Biden administration so far in paying attention to and recognizing, in your case, in your country's case, South Korea's unique perspectives and maybe different perspectives on some issues than the United States? And how important is it to be able to, is it for the United States to recognize and allow for differences of views?
Well, I think the United States and the Biden administration have legitimate and justifiable issues with China, and they should be addressed and very forcefully. But the impression that we get is that the Biden administration has been a little bit, I don't know if that's the appropriate description, but harsh in dealing with China. And perhaps the appearance might be a little harder than the actual policy itself. But as Theodore Roosevelt said, I think it's better to speak softly and carry a big stick. And that's what I would like to suggest if I have the chance, because from where we are, there is a lot of, I think, unnecessary, maybe counterproductive, hard rhetoric. Maybe it's good politics, but it doesn't seem to be a very effective diplomacy.
Ichiro, what is your view of how it looks from Japan?
I think two things are good. One is that predictability has increased, and I think a big elephant like or big donkey should not really change its course too quickly. And I think gradual change, even if the administration changes, is something welcomed in this region. That's point one. Point two, more consultation with allies are made now, like inviting Japanese or Republic of Korean heads of state to the Washington first. And I think those sort of attitude of trying to have more consultation, I think should be very much welcome. It is welcomed.
So, Jim, let me frame this just a little differently for you. We've had this emerging, it seems, consensus in Washington of a shift to a much more negative view toward China that seems to be shared across parties. To what extent does that create challenges for working with our allies in putting together this kind of positive strategy that you all have been emphasizing and that sits in the heart of this report?
So Brian, I think it's more of a generic problem for the United States. I mean, we have a complex policy-making process in the US that involves many agencies within the executive branch and then the executive branch in Congress. And there's a temptation because of all that. By the time we've worked our way through all this stuff, and we've kind of reached our view, that it becomes hard to accommodate different views of other people. So, oh my goodness, we've done all this stuff. We finally got to a common position between the Defense Department, the Treasury Department, the State Department, the NSC, and now we've talked to the leadership in the Hill, and now you want us to adapt to also take into account Korea and Japan. It becomes difficult. And so we need to understand, and I think the Biden administration is off to a good start in this, that if we consult early, before we go through our own internal processes, we have that input, and then we don't have to try to revisit the thing after we've gone through our own internal processes. So the key is to get that consultation engagement at the early stages. And I think one of the good things that the Biden administration has done, as Ichiro pointed out, is that there have been high-level dialogue both with the Prime Minister of Japan and with the President of South Korea before the administration finished its China policy review, which we're still waiting to see. So hopefully there was an opportunity for those leaders to tell President Biden and Secretary Blinken and others how they were thinking about those things. And then hopefully they will all take that into account as they go through their China review, because it's really hard to do after the fact. And I think that was the core of our recommendation, is to recognize that early consultations before positions harden gives a chance for back and forth. And we can say, well, if we understand each other's concerns, we can try to find common ground before each is sort of settled on its own policy. I think, as I say, the process so far looks promising, but we'll see when the administration finally finishes its China review to see whether, from the perspective of South Korea and Japan, they feel, and others, by the way, not just Australia and our ASEAN partners and others, whether those have been taken into account. It's hard on the US side, but I think it's one of the more important recommendations that we made in this report.
Great, thank you. I want to open it up to questions that have been coming in online. And of course, the first question, and one of the questions that's gotten the greatest level of interest, is one of the hardest, goes to the heart of military security issues. And that is, I'd be curious your perspectives, each of your perspectives on this. And it says, where does Taiwan come into this? If there is a conflict over Taiwan, should there be a trilateral response? Is it even feasible? No, this is an incredibly sensitive issue for all countries in the region. But how do we think about that from each of your individual perspectives? How should we think about that? And should that be an area of trilateral collaboration? I don't know who wants to start.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
The privilege of visiting Taiwan at the invitation of President Biden a few months ago. And I think that what's important to recognize is that in the extreme, there may be a military contingency involving Taiwan, but the far more likely concern, which we see even today, is other forms of coercion by China to try to influence what's going on in Taiwan, economic coercion in particular, but influence operations and the like. And there is a place where I think we can most effectively work together. And part of it is to make sure that Taiwan has an economic lifeline so that it's not entirely dependent on trade with China. And so we can think about how to strengthen our economic ties, both individually and trilaterally, with Taiwan so that the ability of China to coerce Taiwan economically is lessened. And think about ways that we can be supportive of Taiwan's democracy. One of the things that I was very proud of in the times that I was in government was to see how strong the ties were between Japan and Taiwan, not so much on the military side, but on the civil society side, on the strong kind of connections between people and organizations. And I think in the end, that's probably as important as the much more difficult, as you said, issue of whether we can have military trilateral cooperation in dealing with the potential military contingency involved in Taiwan.
Ichiro, yeah, please.
I think, yes, Taiwan is very important, but I think we should not be really overreacting to the situation now. As Jim said, I think I agree with him. Of course, yes, Suga and Biden has touched upon Taiwan in the joint declaration, and G7 has done that as well. That's in order to send a message to China that their attitude now towards Taiwan is a little too dangerous, assertive, so calm down. I think that was the message in it, because what was in the declaration has been said by both Japan and United States for a long time, many years. The same thing has been said, so it's not something new. We have not changed the position. Looking at the Taiwan situation now, only 15 countries recognize Taiwan, whereas before it was about 70, and it's coming down every year. And also China's fourth generation planes, the Air Force are increasing now. It's before 2007, Taiwan had more fourth generation fighters, but now it's 2 or 3 times more, and it changed rapidly, the power balance. In that sense, I think China has no way of trying to really make themselves go into taking military option at this stage. That's not very intelligent for them. So I think what we should be keeping in mind is that United States should keep strategic ambiguity, don't encourage independence of Taiwan. I think that never has said that and never will do so, I hope. And Taiwan will keep that stance that they have been continuing, and China should calm down as well. And I think that's what we should be really aiming at, rather than talking about the contingency plan openly now.
Mm-hmm. Good. Sung-Joo, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, let me just say 2 things about the South Korean position. In the first summit meeting between President Biden and President Moon Jae-in, they mentioned the importance of peace in the Taiwan area, which is a very, very special as far as even for the Moon Jae-in government here, because he has been very reluctant to get into anything that may affect the China-US relations. But in Korea, there will be a presidential election in 9 months, 8 months actually, and whoever succeeds President Moon will be much more amenable to cooperation with the United States and Japan in dealing with issues that has something to do with China. The second point about it is that the greatest contribution that South Korea can make is to allow the use of US military capability, whether it's troops or weapons, in South Korea as a part of the U.S.-Korea alliance in the name of what we call strategic flexibility. And I think that is certainly going to be the kind of contribution that South Korea can make without actually South Korea contributing physically in the trilateral effort.
Another question we've got from the audience really asks about broadening the discussion of cooperation in the region broadly, and specifically referring to the Quad. What is the relationship between the kind of your proposals that you've put forward here and potential cooperation with the Quad, which refers to a grouping that includes the United States, Japan, as well as India and Australia. How does what you're talking about here connect to those efforts of the Quad, and are there ways to broaden the kind of cooperation that you're talking about here? Jim, you want to start off?
Sure. I think the challenge, and I think it's a challenge we're very conscious of in preparing this report, is to figure out how do we work together on the many common issues without transforming this into an anti-China alliance. And I think the Quad faces similar problems. The rhetoric is all there, but everybody behind the scenes, sort of says, well, this is really all about how do we contain China. And so that's part of the reason. Sung-Joo will speak to this. I'm sure South Korea has been reluctant to become directly associated with the Quad just because of that potential overtone. So I think the challenge for all of us is it's important to have this like-minded strategy, of have other democracies that believe in the rule of law and open markets to work together and present an alternative to China. But at the same time, we have to balance this with institutions that include China so that everything isn't along a fault line of the institutions of everybody but China. And so that I think would be, this is personally my concern about simply building up the Quad to 5 to 6 to 7, there's a risk that it just becomes, in fact, if not an intention, sort of seen as drawing lines in the Pacific Ocean, as it were. And so we need to work on parallel fronts, which is to have these like-minded institutions, but also to strengthen some of the Pan-Asian institutions, like the East Asia Summit, like APEC and others, where China's included, so that we say this isn't just about containing China or countering China, but also shaping China's views to have China understand there's a role, there's a place for China in these institutions, but China needs to accept the fact that it needs to take into account the views of others.
Sung-Joo, Jim mentioned you. Anything you would like to add in that?
Well, the Quad has actually some problems as such now. Number one, we don't know what it exactly is. Is that is it an alliance or a dialogue forum or something else? But the impression that I think most of us in Asia get is that it is meant to be a mechanism to contain and possibly confront China, China being the focus. And I think on top of that, we have the name itself, which talks about 4, and that is not the way to increase the participation of other countries in the exercise. Be that as it may, it is there. They're now talking about Quad plus, plus. And I think in Korea, with the change of administration, there will be greater willingness and effort to get involved and participate after the changeover, because Mr. Moon cannot succeed himself, so he will have to go, and we will have somebody who is much more would be much more willing to, whichever party he or she comes from, willing to work with the Quad on security issues.
Well, unfortunately, yeah, please join in. Yeah, last word on this.
Thank you very much. I agree with both of the previous speakers about we should not try to contain China on that, and we should continue to assure China and other parallel institutions should be fortified as well. But at the same time, Quad is a very important invention at this stage, and I think broadening of membership or broadening of area should continue to be considered. I think we should not antagonize, but we should really keep to that. And lastly, I would like to thank Ivo Dalda for taking this initiative, and Karl Friedhoff for writing the draft. And I think they've really done a great job, and I really was very privileged to be in this spot. So I'd like to say this, express my greatness for this. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, Ambassador Fujisaki, Ambassador Han, Ambassador Steinberg, I want to thank you for this discussion, as well as your service as chairs on this report. And just as a reminder for people who might want to look at it, this conversation has caused them to want to take a closer look at the recommendations. The title is Cooperating, Competing, Confronting U.S., Japan, South Korea Trilateral Cooperation as China Rises. It can be found on the Chicago Council on Global Affairs website. And this conversation, too, will be soon available on our YouTube page, and feel free to share it with others. So, gentlemen, thank you again so much for your work on this report, for your continued work on cooperation of our countries in response to a very dynamic world. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. 終わりました。